Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is how to form and support your affinity group. And with us, we have presented by the Board of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Presenting today is Dr. Michele Rattigan and Kristen Norine. All right, without further ado, let me throw it right over to Dr. Michele Rattigan. And Kristen, take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the introduction, Darren. And I'm not a doctor yet, but I will be soon, but that's okay. So welcome everyone to how to form and support your affinity group. As Darren had mentioned, my name is Michele Rattigan, and Kristen and I, my fearless co-facilitator, are going to introduce ourselves, and we're going to start with this slide. And this slide is a picture of a screen of an iPhone. It looks like a map, and it says my location with a pin. And the reason why we start with this is because when we're talking about affinity and we're talking about identity and intersections of who we are, it's important for all of us to position ourselves, because even when we are well-resourced, we are always constantly looking at the world and talking about experiences through our own lenses and through our own history, experiences, and filters. So I am a white, cisgendered, heterosexual woman with a hidden disability. I have a position of power and privilege as a faculty member in CNHP, but not as a woman with a disability. I'm also currently a doctoral student, so I find myself on high alert at times regarding my communication style. Sometimes I can push, sometimes I can find myself retreating, and sometimes I have to be really careful when I find myself in spaces where I exist in both roles as a student and a faculty member simultaneously, such as where we are right now online in this Tuesday topic. My experience in being here with you today is in initiating a white racial affinity group with colleagues in my faculty role. And I've invited Kristen to be with me today because Kristen was instrumental in starting this group with me several years ago. So without further ado, Kristen, who are you?
Thank you very much, Michele, and also thank you to Darren. Pardon me. So as Michele said, my name is Kristen, and my pronouns are she, they. And part of that transparency is actually I am in the beginnings of an exploration of what that means in terms of my gender. I've spent most of my life feeling very comfortable identifying as a woman, and I am now finding myself more comfortable identifying as something more than just a woman. I am a professional staffer who started in the Creative Arts Therapies and Counseling and Family Therapies department as their program manager until last year when I took a position with the registrar's office, and now I am an assistant registrar. And those are parts of my identity that I bring in my professional capacity that I think are important to me. Oh, I missed one. I apologize. I identify as white. And that's actually sort of the cornerstone of what I bring into work every day of how does my whiteness intersect and interact with the systems, both inside and outside of Drexel? And how does my whiteness further harm against minoritized communities, minoritized people, and what can I do with that position to make a change? So that is where I am coming from.
So this is just our agenda for today, just to give you just a quick outline. Kristen is going to be going over some terms and phrases. We both are going to be going over some affinity group basics. I will be introducing you to basically a step-by-step of what an affinity group can look like in terms of a beginning, a middle, and an end of an actual group process. And together, Kristen and I will talk about the potential role of affinity groups in colleges and universities, because That's where we all share this space together. And that's what Kristen's experience has been, as well as my experience in sharing an affinity group together as colleagues. So I'm going to move to the next slide. And Kristen, take it away.
Wonderful. So this slide is an image that says words, terms, phrases, and it has several boxes with the terms that I will read out loud. Affinity group, race, culture, personal location, self-identify, equality, equity, calling in / calling out. That's actually reversed, but PWI, which stands for predominantly white institution, and minoritized. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's actually just the teeniest, tiniest sliver of words that Michele and I thought would be helpful for everyone to be familiar with. And while preparing for this, it also occurred to me that this is a great lesson to bring into any affinity group, is that you will come into contact with words that you think you know the definition for. And the person sitting right next to you will think they know the definition for that word as well. And both of your definitions might be different, and how important it is to create a shared language to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So for a lot of these words, I won't go into like the full definitions of them, because what I am going to do is afterwards, we're going to make available a glossary of terms that was put together by Dr. Veronica Carey, who is the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for CNHP. She put in a lot of time and a lot of effort, and I want to give kudos to her right now and the recognition she deserves for this hard work. And this is the basis for having conversations, is making sure that we're all speaking the same language and understanding each other. So affinity groups is what we're talking about right now. It is just, I have my definitions right here from the glossary. Group of individuals who share a common characteristic, interest, or discussion. Race is it's a social construct that involves a person's self-assigned and externally perceived group membership based on phenotypic characteristics. That is a much bigger discussion. And I highly recommend you read the glossary for the full definition for race, because race is is a word that's thrown around a lot, and people generally mean very different things depending on the context. Culture is the environment, social structure, or culture refers to referring to the patterns in the social world. Personal location is something Michele and I just did, which is another phrase I use is to explain what's in our pockets. What are we carrying with us everywhere we go? Self-identifying. Self-identifying is also something that means very close to what it sounds like, which is I identify as white. And I also identify as a person who uses she, they pronouns, still exploring what that means. And what that is it's a reminder that we can't make assumptions about how someone identifies, and that they have to present themselves to the group. Equality and equity both go hand in hand, but do mean different things. Equality is providing the same treatment for everyone. Or as Dr. Carey said in the latest DEI board, equality is allowing everyone access. And equity is making sure that the access is appropriate for their needs. So equity means that people are getting what they need to thrive in any situation. Calling in versus calling out. I want to come back to this only because this was a learning moment for me when I was preparing. So a predominantly white institution is where the university has a majority non-diverse white students, and where a strong anti-racist program can sometimes be met with resistance. I will provide this definition as well, because this actually came outside of the glossary. I'm hoping it can maybe be added. And minoritized is a word that it is meant to convey the full context of what happens to a group of people. It is not benign like minority, which is just a way to describe a number. Minoritized speaks to the context that groups of people find themselves in and how they are treated within a system. So I will go quickly back to call out, call in, because this was a great example for me of learning. Thank you, Dr. Carey, for learning that my definition was not accurate or was not helpful. I always thought of calling out as like, hey, don't do that thing. We don't call out here, we call in. And the anxiety that calling out brings. And when I looked up these definitions, I actually found a really great breakdown where calling out is when we need to let someone know that their words or actions are unacceptable and will not be tolerated, when we need to interrupt in order to prevent further harm. It allows us to hit a pause button and break the momentum. And calling in is when there is an opportunity to explore deeper, make meaning together, and find a mutual sense of understanding. And what that revealed to me, and this is something that I would bring to my white racial identity group, is that calling out has become associated with the right to comfort for me. It was a point of whiteness for me, in that if I felt called out, it wasn't someone interrupting a pattern of harm, allowing us to take a break. It was a reflection on me and my white fragility in that moment, sort of like zinged. And in an affinity group, I would be able to bring this, and I will, to bring this and discuss like what this meant to discover this new vibration in me, essentially, to be a little esoteric about it. But it was really exciting for me to discover that we can create, or we can establish common definitions that are all about bringing us together. So next slide, please. All right, and on this screen, we now have the types of affinity groups, and it is just picture blocks of the words sex, gender, sexual orientation, race, national origin, disability, veteran status, and first generation students. This is, again, not an exhaustive list of what could constitute an affinity group, but these are just examples of where people could start. You might start with gender and then discover an even deeper affinity within that you want to explore. So in terms of when it's time to start creating affinity group, it can be good to start in sort of the macro and allow yourself to discover the micro within your group. Next slide. All right, and now this slide describes how to get an affinity group started, and it has a couple of bullet points that I will read quickly. So you want to identify what the group is going to come around with and their intentions. So again, like an affinity group based on gender, or in the instance of Michele and I, we are involved in one that's based on our race and our intention. So in that, you want to invite 2 to 7 people who share that affinity and are the identity for reducing harm and increasing harmony, which I like. And I think that that's important to establish. Setting a consistent time and place. I will say, as a professional staffer and someone who worked with faculty, this is one of the hardest things. Actually, I think it won't be hard to find people who want to be in an affinity group. What's difficult is finding the time. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we're part of a system that has not given us official buyout in terms of faculty, or buyout of any kind in terms of professional staff, to make this a priority within our professional setting. We work in a system where last minute things happen rather consistently, and that creates a sense of urgency, which can pull us away from consistent meetings. I recommend putting it in your calendar and blocking it off as much as you can, recognizing that things will come up. But if we see that the system wants to pull us away from this kind of work, we might be able to establish like tents, the pegs that you like hammer into the ground. A strong pull might pull them up, but let's make them work for it. How about that? Like a little bit of a pep talk there. So when you are in your affinity group, you want to establish group guidelines and meeting norms. Like I just explained, calling in and calling out. How do we handle when we need to call out someone? How do we work towards calling in people? Michele and I have found recommend rotating and sharing leadership. It might work for your group that someone wants to be the leader and everyone wants them to be the leader. That is also absolutely perfect. I think that it's just important that you find the right level of investment and you be honest about it with both yourself and your colleagues. And it's remembering that affinity group work is really personal. Something that I learned in acting class, they would always say is, this is not therapy, but it can be therapeutic. So it's remembering that we are asking to be vulnerable with each other and to share things that might bring up feelings of shame or concern or anger. And that will get us into what happens in affinity groups, which I pass over to Michele.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And I wanted to add to the calling in and calling out too, is I've read in some other literature that calling out is when you're talking about power and privilege, that when you're in a position, calling out is really powerful when you need to push up against a system, and calling in is very powerful when you're on the same level as other people. When you're working within a group, calling in is powerful, and calling out is powerful when you're pushing up against a system that is being oppressive. So I just wanted to add that to some of the things that you had shared, which is so interesting. So, but go ahead. This is your slide too.
I forgot. I was like, I have one more. Very quickly. So this slide says when to hold affinity groups, and it has 3 different colored bars. The first one says meet at least once a month. The second one says meet for at least 1 hour, although 2 to 3 hours per meeting is what's recommended. And I can tell you, as someone who has been meeting for 1 hour every month for a couple of years now, 1 hour is never enough time. So if you can carve out a little more, highly recommend it. And the third block says it can be online or in person. If you're going to be online, to make sure to use a HIPAA platform. I think that as Drexel employees, we all have access to the HIPAA Zoom account because, again, this is a confidential group.
Excellent. And I have to say that we started our group in 2019, and then COVID hit rapidly. So we kept it going throughout the pandemic online, and we never stopped, right? We never stopped. And so that's a testament to the power of how important that group was. And another thing that I wanted to add is that not only do we meet consistently, we set a time where we meet like the third Thursday of every month. For a little bit of time, it was like the third Tuesday of every month or something like that. And we do carve it out. I love that you had said that, Kristen, and I loved your metaphor of the tent with the, pitching the tent, because people will pull you away from that time, with the invisible fires that happen in academia, where everything seems to be an emergency. The other thing that's really important is to not only block out that time, but have it be consistent, because that's really helpful. So okay, this is coming up. And then there's also situations where things are happening in the world and they're happening rapidly. And we've had emergency sessions with one another. And sometimes not everybody can make it, but you know who to reach out for and say, hey, is anyone available for an emergency session? And we've had emergency sessions together too, which has been just a phenomenal resource to help us keep our heads above water in some really difficult and challenging times. So in this next slide, it's a photograph of a ground, of a road, and there's a white line, and on one side it says start, and right on the other side it says finish. And the reason why we have this picture up here is because every group has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there is a structure to an affinity group. It's not this free form, let's just kind of get together and just, see what happens. It really is important to have an opening of a group, to have a main course of the group, which is you can have multiple options and formats that can be group selected because all groups are different, and then to have a closing for your group. And then in this next picture is a picture of a person opening up very large doors. It's like a dark space, and the light is now coming in to represent opening. So typically in an opening of a group, you have a designator leader who welcomes everyone, who reads the group guidelines. So when the group comes together, you want everyone essentially to work together to have a collaboration of guidelines that the group decides on. And these ought to be read at the beginning of every group. And then we recommend that everyone quietly sets their intention for the group. And some reflective questions can be, what brought them there today? And what are they open to learn about themselves in that moment? And in this next slide, there's a picture of an open book with some images popping off of the page, like a house and people, a tree, a car, life images. And in this slide, it says pre-reads and listens with a guiding question for group discussions. And basically, this is just a suggestion for a main course. Kristen and I have found that in our white racial affinity group, the persons that are connected to our group, we have a really good connection and collaboration and way of being together as a cohort of colleagues. So we tend to come already prepared to talk about a lot of things, but some people might feel like they need a little bit more structure than that. And so perhaps people recommend, hey, let's watch this TED Talk, or let's read this article, or let's look at this book chapter, or let's read this book together and we'll do a chapter by chapter and use it as part of our affinity group. So your affinity group can decide how you want to structure the main course of your group with guiding questions. You can also have a discussion of salient current events, such as personal events, local events, and global events, and how it has given all of us pause to re-examine our roles in harm and in healing. And also, in depending on the type of affinity group it is, it could also be about deeply engaging with one another and taking action. And then in this slide is a picture of a light switch, and it's colored all in blue. It kind of looks like nighttime, and it's meant to represent closing the group. It's really, really important to have at least 5 to 10 minutes to close the group. Don't wait until the very end of the group or the top of the hour to give space. You want to be able to settle before ending, because then it feels like people get caught off and they don't have time to reflect before leaving, especially if you're facilitating the group during a work time. You want to be able to make sure everybody's in a good position to be able to go back to their job, right? Because you really need to have that headspace. So consider in silence or as a, what are some common group threads? What are some common themes? Do remind everyone in the affinity group that themes might leave, but the stories and the persons and the personhoods stay in the group because the group is confidential. You want to reflect on next steps personally and as a group, and you want to end with a reminder of the next meeting day and time. Some things that have happened in groups with Kristen and I is we have given each other suggestions on readings. We've shared podcasts of like, oh, here's a podcast you might want to look at. Based on the conversations that we've had together, we've even given each other some suggestions of things that we can each personally reflect on. And this is something that I wanted to share. Ruth King is a Black queer woman. She's a social worker, and she's also a mindfulness guru. And she wrote the book Mindful of Race, Transformation from the Inside Out. And I had reached out to her several years ago, and this was a message that she had sent to me where we were talking about mindfulness and racism, and we were talking about affinity groups. And she had said, this work is not fun. It's necessary, messy at best. We are all more resilient than we realize. So I'm going to jump and start with this one, and then Kristen, invite you to add anything to this as well. This is a picture of a name tag, and it says, hello, I'm accountable. And I think this isn't just for people on this call. I think this is for people who are not on this call, especially for people who are not on this call. I think this is for all levels of the university. It's really, really important for us to look at accountability, not just in terms of what happens in the classroom, but in marketing, in terms of messaging that goes out, not just in what we're saying, but also in what we're not saying and how that gets delivered to persons, to all people about our university. There's a lot of words, for instance, at the top of our syllabi. There's a lot of words on web pages. There's a lot of information about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And from having been a board member on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and having have been a mentee, and I still consider myself a mentee of Dr. Veronica Carey, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and soul work that goes into the DEI work in CNHP. It's not taken lightly. But if you're just reading words and you're just talking the talk and not walking the walk, you're not really doing the work. And the college and the university also has to put their money where their mouth is. That has to happen. And a part of that is accountability too. So affinity groups is just one part of this. And that does help an institution live into this mission of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It can help us develop better anti-racist and anti-oppressive faculty search and retention strategies. When we're in a predominantly white institution, as Kristen had talked about earlier, I'm in a predominantly white profession of art therapy. I look around to my colleagues and to the wider schools across the U.S. Nation, and a lot of people who are in my position, in my field, are predominantly white women. That's not okay, and that has to change. So affinity groups can help us unpack that for me, from my perspective as a white woman, and say, what do we need to do? So in addition to unpacking, understanding whiteness as a race, how can I stand shoulder to shoulder? How can I be a part of the change? That's really important. How can I join and find the right languaging, the shared language that Kristen had talked about, and call out and push against the envelope as necessary? Affinity groups in universities can disrupt the status quo. Specifically with a predominantly white institution, we can decenter whiteness, but we can also address ableism, heteronormativity, and the colonist structures that dominate curriculum, syllabi, campus life, that silences other perspectives. It can also lift historically underrepresented and oppressed groups. It can also help us recognize microaggressions in and out of the classroom and help us call in and call out as necessary and help us practice that. I think sometimes we just don't know how because we have to practice it. And I don't want to say that is a general statement. I want to own that as a white person, is that sometimes white people are afraid to speak up. And it's time to speak up, and it's time to learn how. Also, we need to learn how to create a more inclusive course content, and not just in the classroom, but in campus experiences across the board. And affinity groups can help us get there. Kristen, I'm switching slides and I didn't mean to. Did you want to add anything?
I did very quickly. I do what I like to think I bring to our affinity group, which was almost entirely faculty, except for myself as the professional staffer. What I have found is that the affinity group experience allows me to bring in that professional staff perspective. Mm-hmm. And there is a small part of me that would love to create a professional staff affinity group, because what I've learned is the way that my whiteness is permeates within the system of Drexel, within any system. I think that it's not fair to say, it is accurate to say that the United States of America is built on white supremacy. And every institution therein is the cornerstone of it. And so it's being able as a professional staffer to say, okay, I'm working within a system that is inherently flawed, because I'm working within a system that didn't imagine someone like me, let alone lots of people who attend Drexel or work at Drexel, imagine them to be here. So what can I do to reduce harm? What can I do to bring attention to it? What can I do to elevate the voices that need to be elevated? And again, the affinity group is a great place to discover, like, how do I feel about it? Because white folks, I am speaking a little general in a generalization, so I apologize if anyone is offended, but white folks tend to get their feelings on everyone else. And it's important that we find places that are appropriate for them, so that we're not forcing other folks to work through our feelings with us, because that's a part of what whiteness and white supremacy has allowed us for a very long time. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for naming that, Kristen. And I also want to just acknowledge you as the lone professional staff in an all faculty meeting, which was not easy, even though it wasn't supposed to be a faculty meeting. Mm-hmm. And you were a phenomenal and remain a phenomenal person in that space. And I agree with you. I think it would be powerful to have that. So thank you for being you and being here with me. I love having you here as a co-pilot.
Thank you.
So what would you like to say about this wonderful slide here?
Sure. So very quickly, this is a slide that has a picture of a group of folks sitting around in a circle, and they are all listening very intently. Mm-hmm. And
oops, sorry.
It's okay.
I got excited.
And these are some tips that Michele and I have found that you want to speak from the I perspective. That's really good, clear communication. It's a reminder that the affinity space is about each individual investigating themselves. And so it's a place where you can learn to listen. It's actually really good. It's a really good place to stretch that muscle. And I'm just rereading this again. It's a space to unpack the beliefs and thoughts that have shaped our interactions with others as a part of that shared group experience. Mm-hmm. So because of what can be very important when creating an affinity space is finding folks who can give a commitment. And that commitment is, as the slide says, to consistency, to keeping things confidential, and centering that shared affinity experience. I think I mentioned earlier that you could start at a macro, and you might sometimes find that there's a micro that several different identities are intersecting. And it's discussing as a group how you want to handle that. That's again, Michele and I aren't offering rules, we're offering guidance. And so that's not to say that something that feels very micro should be ignored, but it's being open and honest with your communication with your colleagues. But yes, Michele, do you have something to add to that?
Well, I just want to add to what you said is that, being open and honest with your colleagues, and that's also going to depend on who's in your affinity group.
Absolutely.
So the other situation we had was different levels of rank. Like we had someone who was our boss that was in our group. And we talked about that. We talked about it as a group to see if that was something that person felt comfortable and that we felt comfortable with. And we did. So not everyone's going to feel comfortable with that because departments and programs are different. So again, this isn't about rules. This is just different things to think about and how you make up your group. And that there isn't one way to do it, but it is certainly thinking about commitment, consistency, confidentially, and sharing it on that affinity experience and coming from the I. That's really what's important. So it doesn't have to be all faculty or all staff. It doesn't have to be, our manager has to be in it. It could be that the chairs have their own, right? And faculty that are not in management positions have their own. It can be departmental. It could be inter-program. It could be, cross-programmatic. It could be whatever you want it to be, but having nothing at all, that's an issue. Right. The other thing, too, is that we're in a predominantly white institution. So white racial affinity groups aren't hard to come by if you're going to make them. Right. So that's just an unfortunate reality right now. But say if you're an international faculty member, you might look in your department and say, I'm the only international faculty member in my department. I can't make an international affinity group in my department because I'm the only person. So that is a situation where obviously you're not going to have an affinity group in your department because you're an affinity group of one. So again, Kristen and I are presenting from our own experience, and our experience is from the dominant right now, which is the predominantly white institution, and we're identifying as white persons. So we come from that filter, but we hope that, just some of these experiences and laying the groundwork that we are, you can also apply it to other affinity spaces as well. All right. So in this next slide, what do you do in an affinity group? Ruth King, again, from that same book, Mindful of Race, she says to wake up and show up together. I love that statement. And basically it's to learn about ... insert affinity topic there, right? So it depends on the affinity shared. And you might be together to process or work through missteps and harm done. It may be to minimize the burden on those around us, right? To reduce that emotional tax and burden on other people who we may have caused harm to in our words or behaviors, both intentional and unintentional. It gives us a way to investigate and challenge the way things always have been done. Can we do it differently? Or it can be to engage and to work deeply with one another and to take action, to celebrate, to lift. Not all affinity groups are meeting together to unpack harm. Some affinity groups are meeting together to celebrate culture and to be proud and to do things that are, just to spread the word about their experiences that do not get to be heard because they're not dominant, quote unquote, dominant experiences. They've been silenced or oppressed or minoritized, in that context. So it does depend on the affinity group and the purpose of the meeting. Did you want to say more about that, Kristen?
No, that was perfect.
Oh, thank you. And I did want to say for accessibility's sake, I forgot to mention, it's a picture on the slide of different people sitting on a couch, holding above their heads little speech bubbles that you would normally see like on an iPhone. And they look happy. So I think they like their affinity group. So in this next slide, what else happens in an affinity group? And it's a picture of a statue of the thinker, someone kind of leaning over on their hands and reflecting in a mirror. And it's about sharing intentions. And this is so important. Being in an affinity group is not meeting to learn about other people. It really is about why you are there. It's about yourself. It's not about Kristen and I are white people meeting together in a white space. We're not there to learn about other races. We are there to learn about whiteness as a race and to unpack that. Kristen, do you want to talk about some of the other things on this slide?
Oh, absolutely. As I said before, the affinity groups are a great place to practice being open to listening, learning, and expressing. We have a group norm, which I feel comfortable sharing, which is we don't coddle each other. When someone's expressing discomfort, whether something that they feel like they did wrong or something that, again, they're feeling discomfort about, we spoke very early on stopping the impulse to go, oh, it's okay. Oh, you're a good person. Oh, it's all right. It was allowing the space, everyone to open up. And part of an affinity group is when someone shares something, being able to understand and express what their story is doing to you. So I highly recommend that to get out of your system the societal expectations of taking care of each other. We're taking care of each other in a different way here, where it's a feeling of support rather than a feeling of shooing away uncomfortable feelings. The next bullet point speaks to that again, remaining focused on your own experience. I think this might be in a different slide, but it's remembering that you don't go to an affinity group usually to fix other people. Something I always have to check myself in, speaking from my experience, is when I have to get off my high horse. I find myself up there like wind blowing in my hair, this beautiful white stallion high horse. And I'm like, oh, I'm not being helpful. I'm not listening to the person who's sharing something. And I am passing judgment on it. I've decided that I know better, that I do better. And that's something for me to investigate. So what I would also say is affinity groups are a place where like feelings aren't bad. They're very important. And to recognize the feelings that you're afraid of, shame, discomfort, sadness, and to just note them rather than try to chase them away. Or also happiness and joy and thoughtfulness. People can be afraid of those emotions as well. So it's important to recognize when we're also afraid of those.
That's true. It's true. I love that we don't coddle each other. But we started off that way. I have to say that, developmentally, I think we kind of did that. It was kind of like this, like walking on eggshells a little bit, like when we first started, like, what is this new space? How are we all going to be? And walking a little bit on eggshells until we got to the point where it was like, no, we can do this. This is really important. We have to unpack some really important stuff because, this is about people's livelihood, including our own. And we need to learn things and we need to unlearn things to learn things.
Absolutely.
And that was really important. So I appreciate you bringing that in. And so we're going to open up to feedback and questions. But Kristen and I, we're not sages on the stage. We're guides on the side. But we're here just by virtue of having been a part of an affinity group for about 3 years. That's why we are an open box of clarification, help, and guidance. And this is our email addresses. If you just wanted to reach out to us and say, hey, we want to get one started, and this is what we're thinking, and can you come talk to us or help us out? We would love to do that. So please just Kristen talked about like what's in your pocket. Put this in your pocket and just know that we are here as a resource for you. So the other thing that's on here is the reference for Mindful of Race, Transforming Racism from the Inside Out by Ruth King, published in 2018. It's a fabulous, fabulous book. I highly recommend it. Ruth King is a lovely, lovely person. I follow her on all social media things. And I just can't say enough wonderful things about that human being who has brought so much to my life and so much joy. I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to our attendees. Any feedback or questions? Oh, I'm so glad Katie is here. Thank you, Katie. Katie was driving. I'm glad she's being safe. Hi, Flossie.
Hey, Michelle. Hey, Kristen. Thank you so much for this really great presentation. And yeah, shout out about Mindful of Race. It's a wonderful, wonderful book that I learned so much from. Thanks to you, Michelle, that I recall when you recommended this, and I've even used it in class. So, but my question is, and I'll say first of all that I was in your affinity group that you've described for a little while at the beginning, and it sounds like it's just really very productive right now. So you mentioned, and this is more of a logistical question, I think, but how you just previously mentioned about a group norm of not coddling each other, and how that you can maybe see developmental stages of the group. And so I'm wondering, was there an intention to create group norms, or did something come up and you said, hey, let's keep this going as a group norm? Or is it just something that you're now observing from the outside as, oh yes, this is a group norm? I'm just wondering how that progressed.
It really seemed, now for anyone who studied group dynamics, it really did seem to develop over time as we built trust. Because even though we all knew each other as colleagues and seemed to have a really good working relationship, as we became more vulnerable and open with one another and unpacking our authentic selves and the things that we thought about ourselves and the things that we felt about ourselves, sometimes it felt like a confessional. Yes, and I'm seeing what Lauren says here. We need to unlearn things to learn things. Yes, that unlearning is so necessary. And as we were having this almost like a confessional moment and building that trust, we came to the realization that just giving each other feedback of like, I'm okay, you're okay, wasn't helping us move forward. It was just helping us spin in a circle. And so when you spin in the same circle, all it does is dig a ditch, and then you're stuck in the same hole. So the way to push forward with momentum is to call that process out and say, hey, wait a minute. We're just telling each other nice things instead of saying, yeah, that was really crappy that you did that.
Right.
And letting us sit with that and say, how are we going to do it differently, or how are we going to do it better? And so I think it took us at least a year to get to that point. And I think that's the other thing to recognize, is that if you don't have consistency in your group, you're going to be pretty superficial. So you really do need consistency and working together to get to that vulnerable spot to really work through some tough and challenging things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just very quickly. And again, this is speaking from our perspective of being in the white racial affinity group. Is, I think, a big theme that it took us a year to really find is being okay with being uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And that is something that we still come up against time and again, where it's finding a way to let go of the judgment of ourselves and each other, so that we can just listen and take in. I will also say that I think we established like a couple of norms right at the beginning, and it was discovering what that norm actually meant. It's sort of like little kids who make rules at the beginning of a game, but they haven't really like tried out those rules. They don't know what they mean yet until the rubber meets the road. And that is what happened to us as well, where we set a couple norms and then we went, oh, okay, that was that norm. Whew. All right, that's what that feels like. So for me, for the last 3 years, a big theme has been, how do I like sit in discomfort? How do I get comfy, cozy in discomfort? I just want to like sit in it like a little egg basket. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Very rich answer. Thank you.
Awesome. Ooh, affinity groups.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Hi. I know I'm look like I'm in Hawaii, but it's okay. Thank you so much, Christine and Michelle. Thank you for that presentation and being a part of D&I. And thank you, Florence or Flossie, for asking that question. Have you? And it sounds wonderful. I have another question as well. Have you, and I'm listening to your feedback in your response to Flossie and handling like the cuddling and stuff. Have you had somebody, that have been in a group and you may have not, and they have displayed microaggressive behavior and through your conversation and through continuing to meet with the group, that behavior may have changed? Or can you speak a little bit about that? Because sometimes that's my concern. And even as today I see, and you try to explain something or talk to somebody about it, and you see these behaviors, and it's like, oh, and sometimes you kind of stuck as the, okay, how do I move forward? What should I say? And you still want to continue the conversation, but you really, have to be kind of careful. So I'm going to let you answer that question.
Yeah. And just to reiterate that, in the affinity group, the focus is really on self-reflection, and we do give each other feedback. And when we give each other feedback, it's not necessarily to give each other advice. But when we're giving each other feedback, it's more of asking each other to reflect on certain things. And so, like, say, for instance, I give, I'm just going to use myself as an example. Say I talk about, I ran into this incident and it made me feel really comfortable and I want to unpack it here. And this is what happened. And say, for instance, Kristen says to me, well, if you are to reflect on that, if in your reflection, do you think there was anything in there that you could have said or done differently? And I might say, no, I think I handled it. And I felt really upset that I harmed that person. And I don't understand how I harmed them. And Kristen's looking at me thinking, oh my gosh, Michelle clearly made a microaggression and she's not seeing it. She's going to be gentle with me because she's going to see that I'm not ready yet. But she might say to me something like, okay, so maybe this is something that you might want to just reflect on and sit with for a little bit, right? So we have to be really gentle with one another. So Kristen's not there to tell me so much what I did wrong, but asking me to reflect on it. And then the other answer I wanted to suggest is sometimes within our own relationships, like I'm not just a cis white woman, right? Like I also have a hidden disability, or we might have someone who is not a cis woman in the group, right? We might have other gender expressions in the group. And so that can also bring up other interactions in the group. And so there may be immediate microaggressive experiences in the group, right? And so that would be a situation where that could be addressed right away because that's happening in real time, right? So if I'm bringing in a story, right, Kristen's going to ask me to reflect on it. But if I harm Kristen in the meeting and I say something inappropriate to Kristen, then Kristen can address it to me right away because that's happening in real time. Is that helpful?
Yes, very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for answering. And I think for myself, it's very interesting. I do like the idea of the affinity groups. But, I always try to educate myself more. So I'm going to get the book and read. I've read some other books, but I would like to get the book and just to read more about it.
The book is also really, really empowering for anyone who identifies as Black or a person of color. Ruth King has chapters in there specifically for, what persons of color can do for empowerment. And they're phenomenal reads. They're excellent. It's an excellent book. And I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Carey had asked a question about exclusionary. Mm-hmm. And that's a great question because sometimes people think that, and then we're going to wrap up. Sometimes people think that racial affinity groups specifically are racist because they're called racial affinity groups and people find them to be exclusionary. Like, oh, you're saying that this is a white group. Is that like a white supremacy group then? Does that mean that like no one except for white people can join? And it's like, well, yes, but it's because we're not emotionally taxing or burdening people who are not white. Like we're trying to unlearn our whiteness, right? So the idea behind it is to educate and to also recognize that a part of being in an affinity group is that you're not in an affinity group 24/7. You're doing the work in a small way, but then you're also connecting with other groups outside of your affinity group to also, in addition to your affinity group, you're doing multicultural work outside of that. Do you want to add to that, Kristen?
I think you said it really well. It's whenever that question comes up, it's always, for me, it's just sussing out what the context of that person, what they're trying to express, what their concern is. Mm-hmm. I think white folks can be scared to join white racial affinity groups because there is the fear of being seen as like, this is a group celebrating whiteness. Mm-hmm. And that is not the intention. Mm-hmm. That's gross, poo-poo, get out of here. White affinity groups, their power is that white folks have to unlearn whiteness from each other and ourselves. Like folks outside of whiteness don't need to be told what whiteness is. White folks do. And so you don't need to come to a study group for something you're an expert in. And yeah, I think that's how I would respond to someone with concern specifically about white racial identity affinity groups. Mm-hmm. But yeah,
that's awesome.
Think, yeah.
That's awesome. Well, we're at the end of our time, and I wanted to just say that, you have our contact information. So if anything else comes up after the fact, please do reach out, and we'd love to help you get one started. Darren, it's all yours.
Thank you, Michelle and Kristen. Great presentation. Really fascinating conversation. Thank you. Really great. And thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you again at our next Tuesday topic, which is going to be live and in person, December 6th, in one of our new conference rooms here in the Health Science Building. So please join us. Love to see you there. Thanks.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.